What happens when a group of men is given a free pass to commit any atrocity without repercussions? The answer can be found in Tiger Force, an elite squadron during the Vietnam War, whose name is associated with one of the greatest shames in US military history. In the impenetrable jungles of Vietnam, soldiers trained to be the best on the battlefield turned into monsters. Murders, mutilations, rapes, and torture. Tigers out of control, guided only by a ruthless order. Kill anything that moves. But the most chilling part of all this is not just the barbarism they unleashed, but what happened afterward. Despite the testimonies and evidence, the US government did everything it could to cover up these crimes, leaving the victims in the dark and the perpetrators free from any kind of justice. The birth of the Tigers, the creation of Vietnam's most feared unit. Tiger Force did not come from nowhere, but was a military response to the strategic needs of the Vietnam War. In November 1965, Major David Hackworth, a man with great vision and ambition, formed an elite unit within the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry, 101st Airborne Division. Its mission was clear: to create a long-range reconnaissance patrol capable of penetrating the densest jungles of Vietnam and eliminating the enemy with maximum efficiency and speed. From this idea, Tiger Force emerged, a squad of highly trained guerrillas whose structure, though small in number, became a feared enforcer of US military strategy. Throughout its existence, Tiger Force did not maintain a fixed composition. At any given time, the number of men fluctuated, but typically, the squad consisted of around 45 men, though up to 120 soldiers were recorded between July and December 1967. The members of Tiger Force were rotated periodically, which allowed the unit to constantly renew itself, maintaining its effectiveness while preserving its exclusive character. Despite its relatively small size, what truly distinguished Tiger Force from other units in the war was the great autonomy they were granted. Once deployed in an operational area, the men of Tiger Force operated with complete freedom to carry out their mission, without the constant supervision that characterized other units. Their objectives were simple: reconnaissance, locating, and eliminating the enemy. However, this open mandate came without clear restrictions on how they should accomplish it, and supervision from higher command was minimal. As long as enemy casualties increased, the military hierarchy remained satisfied. This freedom, combined with a lack of control and accountability, would soon take a dark turn. Without the strict behavior standards that governed other units, the members of Tiger Force quickly began acting on their own, crossing ethical and legal lines. The absence of proper supervision allowed, instead of focusing exclusively on military operations, some men of Tiger Force to adopt a much more brutal approach, beyond any tactical justification. What began as an elite unit with the objective of carrying out high-risk missions became a group that not only violated the laws of war but also unleashed a series of war crimes that would leave an indelible stain on the history of the Vietnam War. This lack of supervision and the climate of impunity surrounding them allowed them to act recklessly. With such a flexible structure and no accountability to anyone, the behavior of Tiger Force soldiers became increasingly erratic and ruthless. The Svi Valley, Tiger Force's descent into brutality. In the summer of 1967, Tiger Force's fate was sealed when it was sent to the Svi Valley, a strategic agricultural point that was at the heart of an even larger conflict. The valley, considered a refuge for Viet Cong VC forces and the North Vietnamese Army NVA, became a key operational stage for US military forces. The objective of Tiger Force was clear: evacuate the remaining villagers to a nearby refugee camp and then clear the area, searching for both enemy fighters and war supplies. To do this, the Svi Valley was declared a free-fire zone. The rule was simple and brutal: shoot first, ask questions later. In theory, civilian casualties were unacceptable, but in practice, the enforcement of that rule was lax, giving free rein to human rights violations. The commander of the operation in the valley was Lieutenant James Hawkins, a man whose ego and bombastic leadership style soon became a burden for his unit. As conditions worsened, Hawkins became more obsessed with his own image and orders than with the welfare of his men or the integrity of the mission. Under his command, combat rules quickly vanished, allowing brutality to take control. Although not all members of Tiger Force can be detailed, two names stand out: Ken Green and Sam Ibarra. Both childhood friends enlisted together, sharing the same training and enthusiasm for being part of Tiger Force. However, what started as a military adventure for these ordinary men quickly transformed into an experience that would mark them forever, irrevocably changing their lives and perceptions of the conflict. From the moment they arrived in the Svi Valley, the soldiers of Tiger Force began to experience a series of events that marked the beginning of a spiral of violence and abuse. On their first day, the unit found a lone cabin in the forest. A man emerged and shot at the soldiers, prompting Tiger Force to return fire, killing the man and destroying the cabin. However, when the soldiers inspected the site, they discovered that the man had been accompanied by his wife and child, both dead in the gunfire. This incident, on the surface, appeared to be a simple case of collateral damage, something the soldiers were beginning to accept as part of the war. But this event was just the first omen of what was to come. The deployment in the valley not only involved a constant battle against enemy forces, but also against the terrain, the weather, and the psychological conditions of the group itself. The unit suffered ambushes, bamboo traps, tripwires, poisonous snakes, and the exhausting lack of resources such as food and rest. This constant pressure led Tiger Force into a state of frustration and paranoia. Every sound, every shadow in the jungle could be the enemy lurking. The need to be constantly alert triggered a series of abuses. The soldiers began attacking villagers who didn't obey evacuation orders or who returned to their homes once the US forces withdrew. Violence quickly spiraled out of control, and what began as a strategic cleaning mission turned into a process of systematic destruction. The lack of control over Tiger Force, along with the growing desperation from the villagers' resistance, led the soldiers to steal, assault, and eventually destroy villages. The huts were burned to prevent the villagers from returning, an act of repression that reflected the brutality and disdain for human life that began to take hold of the unit. As chaos overtook the mission, atrocities multiplied. The men of Tiger Force became agents of a war without rules, where violence spread without any limits. Incidents of cruelty, the spiral of Tiger Force. The brutality of Tiger Force, once set in motion, quickly revealed its darkest face. What began as a mission in the Svi Valley rapidly turned into an increasingly uncontrollable spiral of violence, driven by stress, desperation, and the complete dehumanization of the soldiers. In this chaotic environment, the line between enemy combatants and innocent civilians was completely blurred. One of the first signs of dehumanization was the disturbing attitude of soldier Sam Ibarra. Although he was not the only one to succumb to violence, his growing fascination with burns and human suffering stood out. Ibarra, along with his companion Ken Green, was responsible for one of the most terrifying incidents of the operation. During one of the village sweeps, they found an unarmed man trying to hide under a table in his home. Without saying a word, the soldiers dragged him out, beat him, and ultimately Ibarra killed him in a brutal manner by slitting his throat with a knife. The soldiers justified this act by claiming the man wore a scarf, a supposed symbol of the NVA, though there was never any evidence he was a combatant. This incident was not an isolated act, but the beginning of a series of crimes that became part of Tiger Force's routine. Brutality became normalized, and indifference to human suffering grew over time. The soldiers shared stories about their feats around the campfire, as if the murder of a civilian or prisoner was just another war tale, no matter how cruel or unnecessary the act was. On one occasion, some members of the unit, including Lieutenant James Hawkins, were drunk after a night of drinking. While patrolling the area, they encountered an elderly Vietnamese man walking along a trail. Instead of stopping or questioning him, the soldiers attacked him with the ends of their rifles, enjoying the power that alcohol and war gave them. This scene ended with the old man's death when Hawkins, without hesitation, shot him while he lay on the ground. Shortly after, Hawkins repeated the action with two elderly women who approached the unit, none of whom posed any threat. The violence also extended to those who tried to intervene or question the soldiers' behavior. The team's medic, Barry Bowman, witnessed one of the most disturbing executions. When an unarmed prisoner was captured, the team's sergeant ordered him executed. When Bowman refused, he was pressured until the sergeant, frustrated, shot the prisoner himself. This act of brutality not only shattered the medic's morale, but it also reflected the total collapse of humanity within the unit. One of the most macabre moments occurred when Tiger Force captured two blind elderly men during one of their raids. The soldiers claimed the men were Viet Cong sentries, but the logic behind this accusation was hard to believe, given that the men could not see. As the prisoners were escorted by a 12-year-old boy, the soldiers considered killing them, but the presence of a nearby helicopter dissuaded them from committing the murder at that moment. This incident, along with many others, highlighted the lack of humanity the Tiger Force soldiers had developed. The aggressive behavior of the soldiers not only affected the villagers, but also those who approached them to reprimand them. An elderly Buddhist monk approached Tiger Force to rebuke them for their treatment of civilians. The soldiers, unable to understand his words due to the language barrier, reacted violently. Instead of listening, they accused him of being a VC killer and shot him, placing a grenade on his body as if it were a deserved punishment. Among the soldiers, boasting about the deaths became a constant. Sergeant Robin Vanney, nicknamed One Punch, made bets about killing a civilian with a single blow. After failing in his initial attempt, he found an opportunity to fulfill his bet, ordering another soldier to hold a bayonet behind the captured man. The execution was quick, without hesitation, as a demonstration of absolute power. However, not all members of Tiger Force completely immersed themselves in this spiral of cruelty. Sergeant Manuel Sanchez was one of the few who tried to maintain some integrity amidst the barbarity. After capturing two young prisoners, Sanchez refused to execute them, knowing it was wrong. Throughout the night, he kept watch over them, fearing that someone else might make the decision to kill them. The next day, Lieutenant Hawkins sent two soldiers to relocate the prisoners, but as soon as they left the camp, the soldiers executed them without further consideration. Sanchez, horrified by what he had witnessed, felt trapped in a spiral of violence that consumed his unit. The operation in the Svi Valley, although concluded in August 1967, left a legacy of cruelty that extended far beyond the valley's borders. When Lieutenant Donald Wood attempted to report the crimes to his superiors, he was met with indifference and Tiger Force was quickly reassigned to another mission. Thus, the brutality of Tiger Force did not end with the operation in the valley. It continued with the same pattern of destruction and abuse, like a shadow hanging over the villages and towns they touched. Broken silence. The investigation into the Tiger Force crimes. The story of Tiger Force remained in the shadows for decades, hidden behind a veil of military silence and institutional corruption. While the Tigers continued their brutal campaign, the atrocities they committed were not limited to battlefield violence, but extended to a series of war crimes that accumulated without anyone effectively challenging them. However, as in many cases of injustice, the truth cannot remain hidden forever. During the months of the campaign, particularly in the context of operations in the Svi Valley and Quang Tin province, Tiger Force sank further into an abyss of cruelty. The cycle of unchecked violence not only affected the Vietnamese civilians, but also the morale and humanity of the US soldiers themselves, as evidenced by the testimonies of those few who still maintained some sense of conscience. One of the key moments that reflected this spiral of brutality occurred during a village sweep, when the Tigers, as was customary, had no hesitation in throwing grenades into tunnels where women and children were trying to hide. As they listened to their screams fade during the night, the soldiers knew the bodies would be pulled out by dawn. This type of indiscriminate violence not only occurred with alarming regularity, but was marked by a complete disregard for human life. Amidst this barbarism, the unit's medic, Barry Bowman, found himself trapped between the common sense of his conscience and the harsh reality of orders. After disobeying an order to execute a prisoner weeks earlier, Bowman was forced to shoot a wounded man without any remorse, reflecting that it was no longer about what was morally right, but about pure survival. The situation worsened as the Tigers adopted even more sadistic behaviors. Soldier Ibarra, for example, began taking war trophies, something that became a sort of macabre pastime. Human ears were a common trophy that hung from a necklace, a practice that represented the level of dehumanization the unit had reached. The cruelty of the Tigers was so extreme that many soldiers mentally crumbled, disconnecting completely from any notion of ethics or humanity. The investigation and public revelation of these crimes did not occur until long after the unit was withdrawn from the front lines. Throughout 1967, The orders for the Tigers were clear: get kills. You're from the 327th, so I want 327 kills, was one of the directives given by their superiors. In such a brutal context, war crimes were almost viewed as a metric of success. However, the Tigers not only met the expected number of casualties, but they far surpassed it, even though many of these deaths were of unarmed civilians. In mid-September, Tiger Force was transferred to Quang Tin Province on a mission called Operation Wheeler. This operation marked a new phase of the Scorched Earth policy, aimed at eliminating any NVA presence in the region. But while the high authorities desired quick and concrete results, the morale of the Tigers continued to deteriorate. The lack of accountability, combined with their disdain for human life, drove the soldiers to commit even more atrocious crimes. During one particular mission on September 29th, Specialist Green lost his life in an ambush, leaving the Tigers even more enraged and willing to unleash all their fury on the local populations. It was then that Soldier Ibarra took leadership and ordered a massive attack on a village without considering the consequences. The fact that no weapons were found in the village did not stop the Tigers. They continued their cleaning operation, annihilating any trace of life in their path. What remained constant was the higher command's inability to curb the behavior of the Tigers. Even when Captain Harold Mahar replaced Lieutenant Hawkins, the atrocities did not stop but intensified. Mahar attempted to implement minimal oversight, but the Tigers had already crossed the threshold of morality and ethics. In one of their first missions under his command after encountering civilians, the Tigers continued attacking without remorse, killing 16 people, including children and babies. When the unit was finally withdrawn at the end of 1967, the official death toll reported by Tiger Force was 327. However, these numbers only reflected a fraction of the actual violence, as most of the murders were never reported. Some soldiers, like one who claimed to have personally killed 120 people, admitted that most of the deaths were simply ignored or covered up. The military authorities knew that with so many deaths and so few weapons found, suspicions would begin to arise. But silence was the response from the military leadership, who not only ignored the crimes but allowed them to continue without accountability. Over the years, the testimonies of the few survivors of Tiger Force began to surface, revealing the extent of the atrocities committed. The accounts of violence, human trophies, and the murder of innocent civilians were so chilling that, despite efforts to suppress them, they eventually leaked to the public. The CoverUp, Tiger Force in the Shadow of History. The story of Tiger Force is a dark chapter in the history of the Vietnam War, marked by the atrocities committed by an elite unit that operated under the umbrella of military impunity. Despite the massacres and gruesome crimes committed by its members, it was the indifference of the authorities and the lack of will to pursue justice that allowed their crimes to remain hidden for decades. One of the most significant moments in the history of Tiger Force occurred after an attack on a village, where Soldier Ibarra committed one of the unit's most abominable crimes, the massacre of a baby. This event marked a point of no return, and although many members of the unit remained silent, one of them, a soldier named John Ahern, could not bear what he had witnessed. A few months after this incident, Ahern was killed, but not before confessing what had happened to his fellow soldier Gary Coy. Coy, horrified by what his friend had told him, decided to speak out and share the information with the world. From there, a series of events would trigger an official investigation into the war crimes committed by Tiger Force. After the My Lai massacre scandal in 1968, which revealed atrocities committed by other U.S. units in Vietnam, the Pentagon created a criminal investigations department to address the growing accusations of war crimes. The investigation into Tiger Force was led by Agent Gustav Apse, who, in an effort to uncover the truth, spent years tracking down surviving members of the unit. However, by the time the investigation began in earnest, most of the Tiger Force soldiers had already left the service, complicating the task of finding them and obtaining evidence. Despite the challenges, Aspe managed to compile a list of crimes that included torture, murder of civilians, mutilation of corpses, and executions of prisoners. What made the investigation even more shocking were the confessions of former members of the unit, who, in later interviews, admitted that indiscriminate killings were part of Tiger Force's modus operandi. One of the most heart-wrenching testimonies came from a former soldier who admitted to killing several civilians, saying, "The Tigers killed a lot of people while I was with them, and maybe I shot one or two myself that wouldn't be considered justified." While some of the Tigers showed remorse for their actions, most were not afraid of repercussions, as they knew that the military leadership had chosen to keep the cover-up in place. In 1975, Aspe submitted his report to the authorities, exposing the scale of the war crimes committed by Tiger Force. The evidence was overwhelming. At least 18 individuals, including prominent names like Ibarra and Hawkins, could have been prosecuted for war crimes. However, the US government decided that nothing beneficial or constructive could result in a prosecution at this time. No hearings were held, no charges were filed, and most scandalously, the case was never made public. Although the official investigation was halted, the truth did not remain hidden forever. In 2002, Michael Salla and Mitch Weiss, two investigative journalists, uncovered files on Tiger Force while investigating US war crimes in Vietnam. What they found was astonishing. One of the largest war crimes investigations in US history had been completely covered up. Salla and Weiss spent months gathering evidence. They tracked down survivors of Tiger Force, reviewed radio records from the war, and even traveled to the massacre sites, such as the Svi Valley and the Quang Tin province, to interview survivors of the atrocities committed by the unit. It was exhaustive work, but their perseverance eventually paid off. In October 2003, Salla and Weiss published an explosive series on Tiger Force in the Toledo Blade, revealing the world the atrocities committed by the unit. Their investigation not only brought to light the covered-up war crimes, but it also earned them the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Journalism in 2004. The truth finally came to light, but as expected, justice did not follow. The decline and impunity, the end of Tiger Force. Throughout their time in Vietnam, many of Tiger Force's members delved into the brutality of war, crossing moral lines that for many could never have been crossed. The unit, created to eliminate the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army in one of the war's most dangerous and strategic areas, ended up becoming synonymous with indescribable atrocities. The lack of oversight, the almost absolute autonomy granted to them, and the free-fire zone mentality contributed to a culture of violence and unchecked cruelty that left indelible scars on both the victims and the soldiers themselves. Some members of Tiger Force, such as James Hawkins, the lieutenant who led the unit, never showed remorse for their actions. Hawkins was known for his ruthless attitude and obsession with achieving high body counts, regardless of whether they were enemy combatants or innocent civilians. Despite reports of his crimes and testimonies from soldiers who tried to stop him, Hawkins was never brought to justice and continued his life without facing the consequences of his actions. Other members, like Sam Ibarra, the soldier whose cruelty was known even among his comrades, also went unnoticed after returning to the United States. Ibarra, responsible for acts such as mutilating corpses and taking human trophies, died in 1982 under unclear circumstances, never being judged for his crimes. The culture of violence he fostered during his time in Tiger Force continued to haunt his life after the war, and his name remains one of the most infamous in the unit. However, not all Tiger Force members aligned with the brutality that defined the unit. Some, like Sergeant Manuel Sanchez, tried to maintain their integrity. Sanchez, in an attempt to save prisoners from summary execution, confronted his own comrades, but his resistance proved futile. The unit's culture was too powerful, and although he tried to do the right thing, his life after the war was marked by trauma and guilt. The testimony of figures like Donald Wood, the lieutenant who tried to stop the killings and reported the crimes to his superiors, offers a glimpse into the internal struggle many soldiers faced. Although he was one of the few to raise his voice against the atrocities, his life after Vietnam was equally difficult. The weight of what he witnessed haunted him, and although he fought to do what was right, he could never save the innocent from the unit. Despite complaints from some members and reports made at the time, Tiger Force was disbanded without facing real justice. Although justice never came for the guilty, the memory of the atrocities remains alive in the collective memory, and their story must serve as a reminder of what can happen when humanity is forgotten in the heat of battle. The Silenced Truth, the Public Trial of Tiger Force. Despite the irrefutable evidence of their guilt, the soldiers of Tiger Force never faced justice. However, the most important and significant trial was not the one that took place in the courts, but the public trial that occurred through the courageous work of journalists like Michael Salla and Mitch Weiss. Throughout their investigations, these two reporters uncovered the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the unit and faced a wall of silence that only cracked thanks to their determination. In their book Tiger Force, A True Story of Men and War, published in 2008, Salla and Weiss delved not only into the crimes committed on the battlefield, but also into the deep pressures the soldiers faced in their wartime context. Through heartbreaking accounts from veterans, the authors showed how the military culture in Vietnam pushed the men of Tiger Force to adopt violent and dehumanizing behaviors, often under the threat of being labeled weak or traitors if they did not align with the brutality of the conflict. Many veterans, overwhelmed by guilt, shared stories of horror in which they themselves had participated. However, the true focus of the book was not just the violence on the ground, but the second crime, the systematic cover-up of these atrocities by US military and political authorities. The book was not only an exhaustive investigation, but also a testimony to the moral dilemmas faced by the soldiers. It showed how many of them were caught between their loyalty to their comrades and the guilt of the atrocities they had committed. Despite growing public pressure for justice to be served, the response from the authorities was minimal and evasive. Even when the war crimes in Iraq began to generate strong international outrage, the institutional response to the atrocities of Tiger Force was almost non-existent. The public trial, although essential, did not find an official response, leaving the victims and survivors without the redress they deserved.